When the Galactic Oversight Authority issued its first directive toward Earth, it was framed as a civilizing measure, a calm announcement transmitted across standard channels stating that humanity had been classified as a developing species whose aggressive tendencies required supervision, and the message was received in quiet rooms by people like Daniel Harper, a middle-aged policy analyst who had spent his life studying alien behavior and who immediately recognized the tone not as guidance, but as ownership, because the authority did not ask, it informed, and within days human trade lanes were restricted. Research into certain propulsion methods was frozen by external mandate, and human fleets were ordered to submit to inspection by alien vessels that treated Earth space as if it were already annexed territory, and the public response was confusion at first rather than anger. With citizens watching calm, spokespeople explained that compliance would ensure peace, that resistance would be dangerous, that the authority had kept the galaxy stable for thousands of years. But behind closed doors, military officers like Colonel Andrew Keller, a veteran strategist with decades of experience in asymmetric warfare, were reviewing the data and noticing patterns that did not align with peacekeeping, because every restriction weakened human independence while strengthening alien leverage, and every inspection request gathered detailed scans of human ship architecture, weapons design, and command protocols. And when human diplomats raised concerns, the authority responded with polite dismissal, stating that humans lacked the historical maturity to understand galactic balance. And that phrase spread quickly through command circles, because it was the same logic every empire in human history had used before conquest, and scientists like Laura Mitchell, a propulsion engineer who had helped design the first generation of hyperdrives, were ordered to halt work on projects that exceeded alien-approved thresholds, while alien observers were embedded in human research facilities under the excuse of safety oversight, quietly recording everything and still Earth complied, because humanity had only recently stepped on the galactic stage, and leaders feared isolation more than humiliation. But the pressure increased steadily. Tariffs imposed on human exports, travel permits required for off-world movement, communication delays introduced under security reviews, and each measure was justified as temporary while becoming permanent, and the first open sign of resistance came not from a politician or a general, but from a civilian transport captain named Eric Lawson, who refused an inspection order in deep space after detecting unauthorized data siphoning from his ship systems, and when alien enforcement vessels disabled his engines and boarded his craft. The incident was broadcast unintentionally across multiple channels as crew members were detained, and that image of unarmed humans forced to their knees by armored enforcers did more to change public opinion than any speech, because the authority responded not with apology, but with a fine against Earth for noncompliance, and protests erupted across human colonies, not violent at first, but massive, with signs demanding sovereignty and leaders struggling to calm populations that had suddenly realized they were not partners but subjects, and inside a secure facility beneath the surface of Mars, a small group of officers, scientists, and analysts convened without authorization, including Keller, Mitchell, Harper, and several others whose names would never appear in public records, and they spoke plainly about the situation, about the authority's strategic doctrine, which relied on technological dominance and psychological compliance, about how controlled species were kept divided and dependent, and about the narrow window before humanity would be fully locked into that system. And the conclusion was simple and terrifying, that compliance would end human independence forever, while resistance would provoke overwhelming retaliation. And yet Keller pointed out something the authority had overlooked, that humans were not bound by galactic norms of engagement, that human military doctrine had evolved through centuries of total war, deception, redundancy, and adaptation under pressure, while alien forces favored predictability and protocol. And Mitchell added that several banned research projects had not been dismantled, only relocated and renamed, because humans had learned long ago how to hide progress behind bureaucracy, and Harper summarized the risk clearly, stating that the authority believed control could be applied gradually without triggering a unified response, and that belief was their weakness, because humans historically did not respond proportionally, but exponentially once a line was crossed, and the line had been crossed, and so without public declaration or official approval, contingency plans were activated, supply chains rerouted, civilian industries quietly converted to dual-use production, software updates pushed to fleets that included dormant capabilities, And while the authority continued issuing calm directives and tightening restrictions, convinced that humanity was bending as intended, it did not see the internal shift occurring across Earth and its colonies, where fear was being replaced by resolve and resolve by preparation. And by the time the authority scheduled its first permanent oversight station in Earth orbit, humanity was no longer deciding whether to resist, it was deciding how. The authority announced the construction of the oversight station as a cooperative milestone, presenting it as a shared security hub that would protect Earth from external threats. And the message was delivered by calm alien envoys who spoke of trust, while already positioning construction fleets at precise orbital coordinates chosen not for defense, but for control, because those points allowed dominance over major traffic lanes and communication relays. And human leaders were summoned to attend planning sessions where they were given finished schematics rather than options, and while official representatives nodded and signed ceremonial acknowledgments, the real decisions were being made elsewhere, deep within dispersed human command nodes that no longer relied on centralized authority, but on compartmentalized networks designed to survive decapitation. And Keller oversaw the quiet reactivation of a doctrine that had been retired decades earlier, a doctrine based on denial and deception rather than confrontation, where the goal was not to defeat a superior force head-on, but to render its advantages meaningless. And Mitchell coordinated with engineering teams spread across civilian shipyards, mining platforms, and research habitats, ensuring that every vessel produced over the next 6 months contained standardized hardpoints and power routing that could be weaponized within hours if needed, while Harper monitored alien communications traffic, noting subtle shift in tone and timing that suggested the authority believed resistance had peaked and was fading, and that belief shaped their behavior, because patrols became more rigid, inspection routines more standardized, and response protocols slower as confidence replaced caution. And it was during this period that the authority made its most critical mistake by demanding access to human strategic archives under the justification of transparency, an unprecedented request that crossed from control into exposure. And the refusal was immediate and unanimous across all human political blocs, triggering the authority's first punitive action against Earth itself, a partial embargo that restricted off-world shipments of advanced materials. And the authority expected economic pressure to force compliance, because that strategy had worked on dozens of species before, but humanity adapted faster than projected, rerouting resources internally, accelerating asteroid mining operations, and implementing rationing systems refined through historical crises. And as shortages appeared, they did not break morale but hardened it, because every inconvenience was framed not as failure, but as evidence of encroachment. And when the first authority enforcement wing arrived to inspect orbital shipyards without invitation, they were met with passive resistance, dock workers slowing processes, administrators requesting endless clarifications, systems entering maintenance cycles simultaneously, and while no laws were broken, schedules collapsed, and the authority commanders, and used as such obstruction, filed reports citing inefficiency rather than hostility, missing the underlying pattern. And in parallel, Keller authorized limited field tests of human countermeasures in remote systems, where small alien patrols experienced inexplicable sensor failures, navigation errors, and communication dropouts that were recorded as anomalies rather than attacks, because no weapons were fired and no ships were destroyed. And that was deliberate, because humans were mapping responses, measuring tolerance, and confirming that authority forces relied heavily on centralized command updates that could be delayed or distorted. And as confidence grew within human circles, plans escalated from survival to leverage, because it became clear that humanity did not need to overpower the authority militarily to break its control. It needed to expose its vulnerability to unpredictability. And that exposure began when an authority logistics convoy near the outer colonies received conflicting directives from multiple command nodes, leading to a standoff that stranded several alien vessels for days. And when the authority investigated, it found no evidence of sabotage, only data inconsistencies that could not be traced. And internally, debates began among alien strategists about whether humans were deliberately interfering or whether their systems were simply incompatible. And those debates slowed decision-making further, exactly as Keller intended, because delay was time, and time allowed humanity to finish preparations that would soon make subtle resistance obsolete. And by the time the oversight station's core framework was completed in orbit, the authority believed it had successfully tightened control over a restless but contained species, unaware that in trying to shape humanity into a compliant asset, it had instead unified a civilization that was finally ready to define itself against an external enemy. The oversight station became operational under ceremonial broadcasts that showed alien banners unfolding against the curve of Earth, and while the authority declared the moment a triumph of stability, the human public saw it as an occupation in everything but name, because the station's first actions were not defensive patrols but regulatory transmissions that rerouted civilian traffic, imposed curfews on orbital operations, and required human military vessels to submit flight plans for approval. And this time there was no attempt by human leaders to soften reality, because the population no longer needed reassurance. It needed direction, and that direction came quietly through systems that bypassed official channels, through veteran networks, industrial consortiums, research alliances, and reserve commands that had been dormant but never dismantled, and Keller watched as the final pieces aligned, noting that the authority's presence had accelerated human integration in a way no treaty or crisis ever had, because former rivals now shared intelligence without hesitation. Corporate secrecy dissolved under existential pressure, and even political factions that had opposed militarization now funded it openly. And Mitchell oversaw the activation of concealed production lines that transformed civilian components into advanced systems within hours, because every machine had been designed with modular intent, and every factory worker had been trained to switch roles without notice. And Harper reported a critical shift in alien communication patterns, because authority command traffic showed increased internal friction, with regional overseers requesting clarification on human status, some advocating harsher measures, others warning that escalation might provoke exactly what they were trying to prevent. And that division was the final confirmation that humanity had achieved strategic parity without firing a shot, because control systems fail when certainty is lost, and certainty was gone, and the breaking point arrived when Authority Patrol attempted to detain a human research vessel operating near the asteroid belt, citing a newly issued restriction that had not been previously communicated. And the vessel's captain, a former Navy officer named Kevin Brooks, responded by transmitting a lawful protest and continuing course, trusting that his ship's upgraded systems would hold. And when the patrol moved to disable his engines, their targeting systems failed simultaneously, not catastrophically, but enough to prevent action. And for the first time, an authority commander was forced to withdraw from a human vessel without achieving compliance. And that moment spread rapidly through both human and alien networks, because it shattered the image of inevitability. And the authority reacted as empires always did when challenged, with force disguised as order, issuing an emergency directive that declared Earth space temporarily restricted and authorized enforcement wings to secure key human installations. And Keller read the directive and nodded, because it was a justification humanity had been waiting for, and within minutes dormant protocols activated across the solar system, satellites shifted roles, civilian traffic vanished into pre-planned vectors, and human fleets that had appeared scattered and uncoordinated suddenly moved with precision, not to attack, but to deny access, because the first phase was not war but refusal, and authority forces advancing toward orbital platforms found their navigation data unreliable, their supply schedules disrupted, and their command updates delayed just enough to create hesitation, and hesitation in a force built on obedience was paralysis. And as alien commanders argued over authority and responsibility, human representatives delivered a single unified transmission to the oversight station, stating that humanity rejected external control and demanded immediate withdrawal, not as a request, but as a statement of fact. And the authorities' response was disbelief, followed by anger, followed by the realization that compliance could no longer be assumed. And as enforcement wings prepared for direct engagement, Keller authorized the next step, releasing evidence gathered over months that revealed the authorities' manipulations, the economic coercion, the data harvesting, and the strategic intent behind the oversight station. And that information did not only go to humans, it went to every monitored species within range, because humanity understood that the ultimate enemy was not the authorities' fleets, but its legitimacy. And by the time the authority realized what had happened, the narrative had shifted across the galaxy, and control was no longer seen as protection, but as domination. And in trying to bend humanity into a manageable asset, The authority had created something far more dangerous, a species that learned faster under pressure, unified under threat, and now fully aware that it no longer needed permission to exist on its own terms. The authority attempted to regain control through spectacle, deploying additional fleets into nearby systems and broadcasting firm declarations that framed humanity's actions as reckless instability that threatened galactic order. And for a brief moment some alien governments hesitated, unsure whether to believe the long-standing overseers or the newly defined humans. But that hesitation was enough, because humanity used it to act, not with grand battles, but with carefully chosen demonstrations that revealed capability without inviting annihilation, and Keller directed a series of synchronized maneuvers that showed human ships slipping through authority patrol grids without resistance, appearing in protected zones and withdrawing before weapons had lock, while Mitchell authorized the public activation propulsion technologies that exceeded the authority's imposed limits, not as threats but as facts, showing that human science had never truly stopped, only adapted. And Harper coordinated information releases that paired each technical display with documentation of past authority abuses, creating a narrative that linked human restraint with alien overreach. And as this unfolded, the oversight station found itself increasingly isolated, its command a quest questioned by regional overseers who no longer trusted central directives. And inside the station, alien officers argued openly, some demanding immediate punitive strikes to reassert dominance, others warning that such action would validate every accusation humans had made, and that internal conflict slowed response times further, allowing human forces to secure their own space completely. And when the authority finally ordered a limited show of force by seizing a remote human mining installation, the operation collapsed under unexpected resistance, not heavy weapons but layered defenses, automated systems, and crews trained to fight asymmetrically, and the authority ships withdrew after sustaining damage they could not explain publicly, because admitting loss would undermine their image of control, and that silence spoke louder than any broadcast, because throughout the galaxy smaller species watched and understood that the authority was no longer infallible, and that realization spread faster than fleets, and humanity did not declare war, did not issue ultimatums beyond its demand for withdrawal, because it understood that escalation favored those with numbers while patience favored those with adaptability. And behind the scenes, Keller finalized contingency plans that assumed open conflict while hoping it would not be necessary, and Mitchell pushed final upgrades into every human platform, ensuring that if the authority chose violence, it would encounter level resistance that defied its models. And as days passed without decisive action from the oversight station, confidence shifted decisively toward humanity, not because it was stronger in raw power, but because it had proven impossible to control without cost, and for an empire built on efficient domination, cost was weakness. And when the authority's Central Council convened to reassess the situation, the conclusion was no longer about punishing humanity, but about containing the damage, because control lost in one place invited challenge everywhere, and in that moment humanity ceased to be a managed species and became a catalyst, the ultimate enemy, not because it sought conquest, but because it demonstrated that control itself could be resisted, and that lesson would echo far beyond Earth, reshaping a galaxy that had relied too long on obedience to maintain order. The authority attempted to regain control through spectacle, deploying additional fleets into nearby systems and broadcasting firm declarations that framed humanity's actions as reckless instability that threatened galactic order. And for a brief moment some alien governments hesitated, unsure whether to believe the long-standing overseers or the newly defined humans. But that hesitation was enough, because humanity used it to act, not with grand battles, but with carefully chosen demonstrations that revealed capability without inviting annihilation. And Keller directed a series of synchronized maneuvers that showed human ships slipping through authority patrol grids without resistance, appearing in protected zones and withdrawing before weapons could lock, while Mitchell authorized the public activation propulsion technologies that exceeded the authority's imposed limits, not as threats but as facts, showing that human science had never truly stopped, only adapted. And Harper coordinated information releases that paired each technical display with documentation of past authority abuses, creating a narrative that linked human restraint with alien overreach. And as this unfolded, the oversight station found itself increasingly isolated, its command requests questioned by regional overseers who no longer trusted central directives. And inside the station, alien officers argued openly, some demanding immediate punitive strikes to reassert dominance, others warning that such action would validate every accusation humans had made, and that internal conflict slowed response times further, allowing human forces to secure their own space completely. And when authority finally ordered a limited show of force by seizing a remote human mining installation, the operation collapsed under unexpected resistance. Not heavy weapons, but layered defenses, automated systems, and crews trained to fight asymmetrically, and the authority ships withdrew after sustaining damage they could not explain publicly, because admitting loss would undermine their image of control, and that silence spoke louder than any broadcast, because throughout the galaxy smaller species watched and understood that the authority was no longer infallible, and that realization spread faster than fleets, and humanity did not declare war, did not issue ultimatums beyond its demand for withdrawal, because it understood that escalation favored those with numbers while patience favored those with adaptability, and behind the scenes Keller finalized contingency plans that assumed open conflict while hoping it would not be necessary, and Mitchell pushed final upgrades into every human platform, ensuring that if the authority chose violence, it would encounter a level of resistance that defied its models. And as days passed without decisive action from the oversight station, confidence shifted decisively toward humanity, not because it was stronger in raw power, but because it had proven impossible to control without cost. And for an empire built on efficient domination, cost was weakness. And when the authority's Central Council convened to reassess the situation, the conclusion was no longer about punishing humanity, but about containing the damage, because control lost in one place invited challenge everywhere. And in that moment, humanity ceased to be a managed species and became a catalyst, the ultimate enemy, not because it sought conquest, but because it demonstrated that control itself could be resisted. And that lesson would echo far beyond Earth, reshaping a galaxy that had relied too long on obedience to maintain order. Next 5. The authorities' recalibration came too late to reverse momentum, but not too late to choose violence. And that choice emerged quietly through coded mobilization orders that shifted reserve fleets toward human space under the justification of exercises, because the authorities still believed it could reassert dominance with a decisive demonstration if it acted quickly and limited information flow. And Keller saw the indicators within hours, noting fuel draw anomalies, convoy synchronization, and command priority shifts that matched pre-assault patterns studied from past authority campaigns against other species, and he advised restraint publicly while privately authorizing full defensive readiness. Because humanity's goal remained survival with sovereignty rather than victory through annihilation, and Mitchell coordinated the last phase of integration across human infrastructure, bringing together energy grids, logistics networks, and command systems into a resilient mesh that could function even if major nodes were destroyed. And Harper tracked the reaction beyond human space, observing that several monitored civilizations had begun delaying compliance with authority directives, emboldened by the precedent humanity had set, and that widening defiance increased pressure on the authority to act harshly against Earth to deter further erosion. And the flashpoint arrived when an authority task force crossed into a restricted zone near the outer colonies and attempted to establish a forward control platform without negotiation. And this time humanity did not obstruct passively, because Keller authorized control denial operation that used non-lethal, but decisive measures to immobilize the task force, disabling propulsion and isolating communications while broadcasting every step of the encounter across open channels. And alien commanders found themselves stranded and visible, unable to claim misunderstanding or anomaly, and the authorities' response was immediate escalation, issuing a declaration that labeled humanity a destabilizing threat and authorizing force to restore order. And that declaration, intended to rally support, instead fractured it, because the evidence was already public, showing that the authority had initiated the confrontation. And as enforcement fleets advanced, they encountered a defense environment unlike any they had faced, layered with decoys, adaptive countermeasures, and tactics that did not align with standard engagement models. And authority commanders reported confusion, inconsistent targeting solutions, and human vessels that refused to fight on predictable terms, striking supply lines, command relays, and coordination nodes rather than engaging directly. And losses mounted not in dramatic explosions, but in stalled operations and aborted advances, which was worse for an empire built on efficiency. And within human space, the population remained unified, accepting disruptions and risk with a clarity that surprised even their own leaders, because the threat was no longer abstract. And as the authorities struggled to bring its power to bear, Keller recognized the shift from defense to deterrence, understanding that humanity had reached a point where continued attempt to control would impose unacceptable cost. And so humanity issued its final message not as a plea or threat, but as a conclusion, stating that it would defend its autonomy indefinitely, and that any further attempts to impose oversight would be met with resistance that would spread instability far beyond Earth. And that message was heard clearly across the galaxy, because it was backed not by bluster, but by demonstrated capability. And in trying to force obedience from a species that adapted through pressure, the authority had created a strategic adversary defined not by aggression, but by refusal, an ultimate enemy not because it sought to rule others, but because it proved that control itself was not inevitable. The authorities' attempt to contain the situation through limited escalation collapsed under the weight of its own structure, because as fleets were tied down managing human resistance, compliance slipped elsewhere, and reports flooded Central Command showing delayed responses, missed quotas, and outright refusals from species that had quietly endured oversight for generations. And Keller understood that the authority was now fighting two wars, one against humanity and one against the idea that control could be challenged, and ideas spread faster than fleets. And so humanity shifted strategy again, not pressing attacks, but opening channels, because Harper advised that silence now allowed the authority to frame a narrative as rebellion rather than correction. And so human envoys began broadcasting openly, not with rhetoric but with data, showing timelines, directives, and consequences, and explaining in plain terms how oversight became domination. And those transmissions were not aimed at the authority but at everyone else, and they were received with attention because they were calm, detailed, and consistent. And meanwhile, Mitchell oversaw the deployment of a new generation of defensive platforms that were deliberately visible, stationed at key junctions, and designed not for a first strike, but for denial, their presence signaling that human space was no longer permissive, and authority planners noted with concern that these systems were built redundantly, cheaply, and in numbers that suggested humans could replace losses faster than projected. And that realization forced a reassessment of cost models that had previously assumed humans would exhaust resources quickly. And inside the oversight station, tensions reached a breaking point as officers argued over responsibility, with some advocating a decisive strike on Earth itself to break morale, and others warning that such an act would unify the galaxy against them, because Earth had become a symbol, and symbols could not be destroyed without consequence. And while those debates dragged on, human forces continued to refine their approach, learning from every encounter, updating systems in real time, and adapting tactics faster than the authority command cycle could adjust. And Keller remarked privately that the authority was not losing because it lacked power, but because it lacked flexibility, and that was a flaw no amount of force could correct quickly. And as weeks passed without resolution, the authority's image eroded further, because empires depended on perception as much as capability, and perception was now fractured. And when a mid-level authority commander attempted to independently negotiate a localized ceasefire with a human fleet to secure supply access, the act was leaked almost immediately, revealing internal desperation and lack of unified command. And that leak did more damage than any battle, because it showed that the authority no longer spoke with one voice, and humanity did not exploit the moment with triumph or humiliation, instead maintaining consistent demands and measured responses, reinforcing the contrast between rigid control and adaptive autonomy. And in that contrast, the ultimate threat became clear, because humanity was not trying to replace the authority. It was proving that the authority was unnecessary, and for a system built entirely on centralized oversight, that proof was existential. And by the time the authority convened its emergency summit to address the cascading loss of compliance, it was no longer debating how to control humanity, but how to survive the consequences of having tried. The emergency summit convened by the authority was tense and chaotic, with delegates from multiple sectors arguing bitterly over what had gone wrong, some demanding immediate military intervention to crush humanity before the situation worsened, others warning that any aggressive move would only validate the warnings humans had broadcast and further embolden other species. And in that tension, the cracks in the authority's cohesion widened, because decades of centralized control could not adapt to a decentralized, adaptive opponent. And Keller watched the indicators closely, noting how alien fleets hesitated in transit, how logistics pipelines became inefficient, and how command messages were repeatedly questioned by subordinate officers who feared making a mistake. And within human networks, Mitchell oversaw the final phase of readiness, deploying redundant systems across civilian, industrial, and military nodes, ensuring that every element could operate autonomously if attacked. While Harper disseminated intelligence throughout human space that mapped authority vulnerabilities, highlighted over-reliance on protocols, and exposed internal divisions, and these transmissions were factual and unemotional, designed to demonstrate capability without provocation, and as authority fleets moved toward key human positions in an attempt to reassert dominance, they encountered a web of defenses that were simultaneously physical, digital, and strategic, because humanity had layered every possible measure to delay, misdirect, and neutralize, and the authority found its ships immobilized, communications jammed, and command chains fractured, not because humans outnumbered them, but because they had adapted faster and more creatively than the Empire could anticipate. And in the midst of this standoff, humanity issued a final transmission, calm, clear, and uncompromising, stating that authority forces must withdraw from human space immediately, that any continued attempt at control would be treated as aggression, and that humanity would defend itself indefinitely. And that message resonated across the galaxy, because it was backed not by threats or rhetoric, but by evidence of capability and demonstrated success, and alien species watching realized that the authority was no longer invulnerable, that resistance was possible, and that compliance was optional. And inside the Authority Council, the realization dawned that they had misjudged humanity entirely, that in attempting to control a species, they had underestimated its adaptability, cohesion, and strategic insight, and that miscalculation had created the ultimate enemy, one who did not seek conquest but could not be coerced. And as human forces maintained readiness without overextending, the authority began to withdraw incrementally, not because it was forced to, but because continuation of the conflict would fracture its own power further. And by the time the final ships disengaged, humanity had secured its autonomy, demonstrated its capability to the wider galaxy, and irrevocably reshaped the perception of what a species could achieve when underestimated. And in that reshaping, the ultimate enemy had been born, a civilization that had proven through resilience, ingenuity, and unified action that it could not be controlled. And that realization would echo throughout every council chamber, fleet command, and planetary administration, leaving a galaxy that had relied on obedience to understand that some forces could never be constrained without consequences too costly to bear. With the authority in retreat and its fleet scattered or immobilized, humanity moved deliberately to consolidate its position, not in vengeance but in preparation, because Keller understood that the moment of survival had passed into a moment of influence, and every system under human control was carefully surveyed, upgraded, and networked, creating an interlinked grid of logistics, defense, and communication that operated autonomously yet cohesively, while Mitchell coordinated the integration of every technological asset, from orbital platforms to asteroid mining stations, into a resilient architecture that could withstand direct attack or prolonged isolation. And Harper ensured that intelligence gathered throughout the conflict was codified, analyzed, and shared across civilian and military channels, so that no opportunity for insight would be lost. And as human colonies transitioned into the state of adaptive sovereignty, the authority struggled to reconcile its own failures, issuing directives that oscillated between forceful command and cautious diplomacy, revealing the depths of internal fracture and other galactic civilizations observed, some with apprehension, some with cautious respect, as humanity demonstrated that it could act decisively, coordinate complex systems, and leverage minimal force for maximum strategic impact. And in these demonstrations, the true scope of human capability became undeniable, because what the authority had interpreted as chaos was, in fact, a structured, disciplined, and flexible approach that exploited weaknesses inherent in rigid empires. And as months passed, humans established permanent protocols for defense, trade, and exploration that reflected autonomy rather than oversight, ensuring that every future engagement will be negotiated from strength, not imposed hierarchy. And across the galaxy, whispers of the ultimate enemy began to circulate, a term first used in private councils that now found expression in public debates, Because humanity's resistance had proven that no force could reliably coerce a species that refused submission, and that proof reshaped alliances, commerce, and strategy far beyond Earth's immediate sphere, and for the authority itself. The lesson was profound and unavoidable, that attempting to control humanity had not only failed, it had created an adversary whose capabilities, cohesion, and unpredictability could not be reversed. And so in the quiet aftermath, humans did not celebrate with conquest, but with preparation, ensuring that autonomy was preserved, systems were fortified, knowledge was shared, and the galaxy recognized, through the unspoken understanding of every council, fleet, and observer, that the species which had once been dismissed, underestimated, and regulated had emerged as something fundamentally uncontrollable, an ultimate enemy not born of aggression, but forged through resilience, ingenuity, and the undeniable will to remain free. And as humanity looked to the stars, it did so knowing that the galaxy would never again assume compliance, because the very act of trying to control them had ensured that from this point forward, humans would act on their own terms, shaping history not as subject of authority, but as architects of their own destiny.